That was jazz musician Coleman Hawkins performing in the Netherlands in 1935. And he was setting the tone for us now as we commemorate Black History Month and jump right into the theme of today's show. Welcome. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. While Nazi racism was primarily directed at Jews, individuals from other minority groups were also targeted, including Black Germans. Today, we'll be discussing the threat that the Nazis posed to Black artists in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. And with the help of our guest speakers, we'll learn how American passports protected two Black artists who were living in Europe and how two Black German performers were exploited by the Nazis because of their so-called race. I'm pleased to welcome our first guest, Dr. Kyra Thurman, who is an assistant professor of history and German at the University of Michigan, and in fact also herself a classical musician. Good morning, Kyra.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And also my colleague and friend, Kyra Schuster, spelled differently but pronounced the same, a curator here at the Holocaust Museum who is closely connected to the artwork and some photographs that we'll be examining in today's program. Good morning, Kyra Schuster.
Good morning. Thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you. Viewers, please post your questions for our guests in the comments section, and we'll get to as many of them in the course of the live show as we are able. Now, Dr. Thurman, I'd like to begin with you. Could you please set the scene and give us a sense of what the cultural environment was like in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and especially what made it so appealing, especially to Black artists?
Sure. So in the 1920s, European cities like Paris and Berlin were cultural hotspots. And jazz music, like the music we heard at the beginning of this program, was becoming increasingly popular. So Black people from the Americas, the Caribbean, from Africa as well, were drawn to these European cities like London and Vienna, where they could wander around freely and enjoy the freedom of sitting at a cafe and sitting on the train and going to theaters. Before the Nazis came to power as well, cities like Berlin were extremely vibrant, dynamic cities that attracted people from many different backgrounds. Their nightlife was filled with cabaret shows, vaudeville performances, people dancing the Charleston, and lots of classical music troupes as well. So African-American artists started performing in mainstream venues, something they couldn't do that easily in the United States. So performers like Josephine Baker, for example, rose to fame in Paris in the 1920s. Aeneas Berry and Villeda Snow also took to the stage in London in the 1930s. And Marian Anderson, the famous opera singer, also made her career first in Europe and became an international superstar there before coming back to the United States in the 1930s and 40s and becoming part of the civil rights movement. She later also became the first Black opera singer to perform at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City in 1954.
So really, it was a kind of incubator for people who would later become giants, legends in their fields.
Absolutely.
Kyra Schuster, I'd like to bring you in and let's bring it down to the individual level, learning about someone who left his country in search of career opportunities in Europe. Please introduce us to American jazz musician Freddie Johnson.
Freddie Johnson was a talented jazz pianist from New York and one of many musicians drawn to Europe. He and other Black American performers couldn't get gigs and opportunities in the United States like they could in Europe. And after gaining traction with fellow musicians in the US, Johnson performed on a European tour in 1928 and 1929. Racism and exoticism existed in Europe, but some Black Americans like Johnson found less overt racial discrimination there than they did in the United States. There was a noticeable difference from the Jim Crow South, where violent lynchings were a constant and real threat. After the tour, Johnson and his family made Europe their home. They were in search of a better quality of life for all of them and looking for professional opportunities for himself. Eventually, they moved to the Netherlands, and here we see a photograph of his wife, Ida, with her friends at a bar in The Hague. Johnson was able to land a variety of gigs. He performed on his own with other artists. Here you see a great photo of him playing piano with the Coleman Hawkins Jazz Trio, who you heard at the top of the show, in Amsterdam in 1938. And yeah, just lots of gigs and lots of work for him there.
And we're hearing from some Freddie Johnson fans here on Facebook. A viewer named Rick writes in to say, another unmentioned victim of racism who brought nothing but joy and happiness to all people. Freddie inspired me to play the piano, especially jazz. And Kyra Thurman, I believe that you are a pianist yourself, right?
I am. Yeah.
So, Kyra Thurman, Johnson was in Europe when the Nazis rose to power in neighboring Germany in 1933, and they immediately embarked on a sort of culture war that demonized not only jazz music, but also other art forms. Why jazz? What did they have against jazz?
So, as in so much of Europe, jazz was extremely popular in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. The fact that it had its roots in Black American music was liberating and thrilling and exciting to some. But the fact that it had its roots in Black American music was also, for the Nazis, the reason why, frankly, this music should be banned. The Nazis did not want to celebrate any kind of Black creativity and music, and they really saw jazz as a threat to German culture and society. And really, what the Nazis also wanted by banning jazz was to uphold whiteness and their definition of it. So, in an effort to control society, they started prohibiting jazz on German radio stations, and they denounced jazz as degenerate and the product of people they deemed racially inferior. And we can see that clearly in this propaganda brochure. In particular, we see derogatory racist imagery being used, the stereotyping of Black features with large lips, wearing an earring, almost ape-like features. Again, this is sort of the racist stereotyping. We also see on it, though, the Star of David pictured on the lapel. And it shows that the Nazis are starting to associate jazz music with Jews. They argued that jazz was music that was inferior, made by Black people who they deemed inferior, and marketed by Jews, which was feeding into this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews controlled the entertainment industry, along with other aspects of society. You know, that said, as much as they tried to ban jazz, it was so popular that they were aware of its popularity and conscious of it. So they also tried to rebrand it, calling it German popular music. So sometimes they would literally take the same tunes and same melodies from jazz and try to rebrand it as German popular music.
So kind of playing both sides of it. On the one hand, suppressing it, and on the other hand, saying, let's capitalize on it. Let's be opportunists and see if we can use it and exploit it to our advantage.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'd like to pause for a minute to welcome our viewers who are joining us from all around the country. Good morning to you in Birmingham, Alabama, Reidsville, Pennsylvania, Burnsville, Minnesota, and Savannah, Georgia. And a warm welcome to our international viewers who are watching from as far-flung as Brazil, Norway, Poland, Denmark, and Portugal. We're so glad that you are all here with us today. Now, Professor Thurman, against this backdrop, did the Nazis' efforts to demonize jazz impact a musician like Freddie Johnson in his career or life in Europe?
No, or not in the ways that we might initially think. The Nazis' efforts to control jazz didn't affect Johnson per se, who was living in the Netherlands. So he was relatively safe in the Netherlands, even up until 1940, when Nazi Germany occupied the Netherlands. But Johnson's life changed dramatically in December 1941, after the Nazis declared war on the United States and America joined the war. And it's really at that point that he and other Americans living in Nazi-occupied countries were considered enemies as citizens of a warring country. So Johnson was arrested in 1941 in December and sent to Tittmoning, a subcamp of the Laufen internment camp for foreign nationals in Germany.
And we have a question from a viewer named Gloria. She's asking, what happened to Freddie Johnson's wife and daughters? You had mentioned the whole family moved to Netherlands.
Right. So his wife and daughters did not go with him. They were arrested almost a year later and sent to a different internment camp, Liebenau.
And I think that you made an important distinction that I want to make sure doesn't kind of float by us, that Freddie Johnson and his family, they were not arrested as part of a racial policy on the part of Germany, but in this case, because they were citizens of an enemy nation of the United States who was now at war with Germany. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was not facing racism, I assume, right?
Definitely. That he and other African-American performers still experience racist persecution at the hands of the Nazis. So, for example, Violating Snow, who we mentioned earlier on in the program, was also in a similar kind of camp and was called a black pig and treated terribly by the Nazis, for example.
And also to point out even some of the successes that we were describing earlier, as Kyra Schuster had described, there was this element of exoticism, of being some kind of, imported, different kind of person, that also led to the appeal of jazz, that it was not considered local, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that absolutely also factored into their treatment.
We have another viewer comment. Someone named Terry writes in to say that she wishes that individuals like these were recognized in history books and that their stories came around throughout the year, not just in February, which here in the US is Black History Month. Terry, I agree. Our whole production team agrees. I'm pleased to say that we have produced several programs shining a light on the achievements of Black Americans, including one from last spring about actress and spy Josephine Baker. And we'll share a link to that program at the end of today's show if you'd like to check it out. Now, Kyra Schuster, I understand that Freddie Johnson, we know he's imprisoned in this basically enemy camp, this enemy prison with other Black artists. Tell us about a man who was his fellow inmate named Josef Nassy.
Josef Nassy, whose photo you see here, was a portrait artist originally from Suriname in South America. And he happened to also be imprisoned in Tittmoning along with many of the other artists. Nassi was living in the United States when he decided to move to Europe for an engineering job. And even though Nassi wasn't an American citizen, he managed to get an American passport that he needed for work pretty easily. He simply listed his birthplace as San Francisco on his passport application because the city's records had been destroyed in an earthquake. And so nobody questioned him. He was issued an American passport and moved to Europe in 1929, eventually settling in Belgium. And his passport fooled the Germans as well. So after the United States entered the war, Nassi was then arrested as a foreign enemy as a citizen of the United States. Both Johnson and Nassi were imprisoned throughout World War II for being Americans in Europe. And again, they were just simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I mean, Nassi's identity is so complicated. If he had actually stayed with his original citizenship, perhaps he wouldn't have been arrested. As you mentioned, he's from Suriname. He's also Black, and he also happened to be of Jewish descent on his father's side, although I don't think the Germans ever discovered that. Nassy produced artwork, and this is how we know about him at the Holocaust Museum. He produced a large body of artwork while he was imprisoned in German internment camps. What do they tell us about life inside these camps?
In a way, I think the artwork goes even deeper than what you would get simply from a photograph taken in the internment camp. And so while we do have photos from Tittmoning of the outside grounds and some of the prisoners, Nassi's artwork really depicts the conditions and the daily life they were experiencing behind the walls. So we have a brief slides of some of his works. He painted and drew a number of camp landscapes that we're starting with. They help us understand the environment they were living in, what he saw and experienced while he was imprisoned, the snow, the winter conditions they were under. And then in the final image, we see a guard in a watchtower looking over a prisoner, and it shows really how Nassy and his fellow inmates were still under constant scrutiny and watch.
Under scrutiny and watch, at times exploited for work, not allowed to leave. But I also want to make sure that we note that Tittmoning was not a concentration camp and that the conditions there were radically different than those with which we are familiar from other chapters of Holocaust history. Prisoners like Johnson and Nassy were actually protected under international law and therefore treated more humanely than others in the Nazi camp system. So in other camps, there would be the more familiar abuses like starvation, torture, even systematic killing. It's not the case at Tittmoning, although it's certainly not a place that someone would want to be or would choose to be. Now, Kyra, these images are so powerful. How did Nassy make them? It's hard for me to imagine that he would have brought, a full body of art supplies with him to Tittmoning.
So Nassy received his art supplies from the International YMCA. They provided him with sketch pads, oil paints, and the other art supplies he needed. And other prisoners also were given what they needed to create their own art. So musical instruments were supplied, for example. And this is really an indication of how well, and again, relatively speaking, that the prisoners in internment camps like Tittmoning were treated as opposed to other camps throughout Europe. And Nassy captured this element in some of the more personal art and images images he created of his fellow inmates. Here you see a group of prisoners painted in very vibrant colors. They're tracking the war on a map, a prisoner eating with some other small sketches to fill up the page in the background. There's one gentleman who looks like a musician. You can see the musical notes on the paper. And in the last painting, which is simply titled Tittmoning, if you look closely in the upper left-hand corner, Nassi inserted himself in the image, creating artwork. Music was also a theme in several of Nassi's works. We actually do have, we have a photograph of Johnson in the camp playing piano that was taken in the camp side by side with a drawing done by Nassy of Johnson playing piano in the camp. And Nassy was able to create more than 200 works of art, amazingly, while he was imprisoned in the internment camps. And these are really, you know, his visual diary of his 3 years in internment.
And really give us, as you said, insights, add texture and mood to what the environment was like. And we had a viewer named Jeffrey asking about what daily conditions were like in a place like Tittmoning. Jeffrey, I hope that some of these pictures answered your question in a more firsthand way. We have another audience question, and perhaps, Professor Thurman, you would be able to shed some light on this. A viewer named Chuck is asking whether American jazz musicians back home in the US did anything to call attention to the treatment of their fellow jazz musicians in Germany in the 1930s. What do you know about that?
Oh, yes, they did so much work to call attention to the treatment of jazz musicians in Germany. So if you look at African-American newspapers in the 1920s and 30s, they're talking about jazz musicians and their careers in Germany. They're so excited about it. But then also with the rise of Nazism, you see African-American newspapers reporting more and more their concern and worry and fear for Black Americans living abroad, as well as for the life of Jews in Germany and how they're being treated as well. So that does become a common theme in the 1920s and 30s.
Definitely a feeling of identification, of comradeship with others suffering from racism around the world. Tell us, though, let's go back to Germany. And I'd like to get a better sense of what life was like under the Nazis for Black Germans, not for Americans abroad, but for people where this was their home.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, and you know, we've been talking a lot about Black Americans, but it is also, of course, important to understand that there were Black Europeans, you know, and other kinds of minorities in Europe. So, for Black Germans in particular, living under the Nazis, life was extremely precarious. It's believed that there were about 2,000 Black residents in Germany in 1933, mostly in Berlin. The Nazis didn't have an organized program that targeted Black Germans per se, like they did for Jews, but they nonetheless considered them to be racially inferior. Many were discriminated against and persecuted by local authorities. So, for example, Nazi racial laws prohibited Black Germans from attending university. It prohibited them from taking certain kinds of jobs. And so many Black Germans actually lost their jobs when the Nazis came to power, and they also had difficulty supporting themselves and their families. Over time, more and more Black Germans became socially and economically isolated. And moreover, Nazi propaganda campaigns discouraged friendships and relationships of any kind between white and Black people, as you see from this propaganda poster here, which says the result is the first thing, and then, you know, racial pride diminishes if you're friends with a Black person. So interracial couples were harassed in public. White German partners were pressured to divorce their Black spouses. The Nazis viewed Black Germans really also as a threat to German racial purity. And so here it's really important to think about the distinction between Black Americans and Black Germans in this way, that if Black Americans could flee Germany and go back to the United States with their US passports, Black Germans didn't have that possibility. So some tried to escape to France, for example, only to get caught and sent back to Germany. So by the end of 1937, unfortunately, the Gestapo had started secretly rounding up and forcibly sterilizing many Black Germans. Others would later be incarcerated or murdered because of their race.
So taking an increasingly sinister and violent turn. We have a question from a woman named Renee asking whether Black Germans were required to comply with filling out the 1939 minority census in Germany, or the Residentenliste. Can you briefly explain that?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really great question. And I actually don't know the answer to it, although there are a couple of historians like Professor Robbie Aitken, who's working on Black Germans in Nazi Germany, who might have an idea. So the 1939 minority census, I mean, also Professor Friedberg, if you also want to talk about it as well, or Residentenliste, demanded that racial minorities list their home address, that they had to officially register with the government, with the Nazi government. And yeah, that would be so interesting to look into. I just haven't personally looked into that myself yet.
I think it also kind of suggests a broader question that some of our audience members might be surprised to know that there were any Black people living in Germany at the time. Who were they? What were their origins? If you can say very briefly.
Sure, really briefly. It's really complicated. Some are tied to colonialism. Some are tied to, African-American history. There have actually been Black people in Germany going back to the medieval era. So, so some had long, deep ties and connections. Others were recent arrivals and immigrants. But regardless, the Nazis wanted them out, right? And saw them as threats to German racial purity.
Another viewer named Cindy writes in to say this is heartbreaking, that the Nazis were racist against every race or creed unless you were of what they called the Aryan race. No one should ever forget the victims who suffered. Thank you for that, Cindy. That's why we're doing this program, and we're glad that it resonates with you. Now, Dr. Thurman, let's look more closely at the challenges that Black Germans faced. You mentioned that they were prohibited from joining a lot of professions, but yet, they have to buy groceries, they have to pay the rent. And I understand that some Black Germans found protection and livelihood in the arts. Please tell us about one person in particular named Marie Nejar.
Yes, happy to. So Marie Nejar was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1930, and she was just a toddler when the Nazis first came to power. Her father was a Black sailor from Ghana, and her mother was a child of a white German woman and a Creole man from the island of Martinique. Nejar was raised primarily by her white grandmother, and she felt comfortable more or less in the quote unquote white world. But racism absolutely affected her daily life. She longed to have blonde hair and blue eyes like so many of her friends. She used to constantly wash her skin to try to get it lighter, to have it be a lighter skin tone, so that she could be accepted by Nazi youth organizations like the League of German Girls. Her artistic talents were first discovered in school, and by the 1940s, Nejar was acting in propaganda films.
And many people watching may not have seen a lot of Nazi propaganda films or only seen ones that show nasty stereotypes of Jews. So let's take a look at a short clip from one of these, a 1943 movie called Munchausen. Wow, really quite the production, feels like some of the grand Hollywood spectacles of the time with the costumes and this clearly exoticized music. How did Marie Nejar, very young, how did she get involved? And why in the world, in the middle of the war, 1943, would the Nazis have expended so much energy and resources on making this kind of lavish movie?
Right. So it was actually Marie Nejar's first film, and the German propaganda minister, Josef Goebbels, called for Black children to be used in films where they could play the part of African natives. And so in this way, for a lot of Black Germans, they kind of ended up like props in these different films, and in this film in particular. So some say for this film that everybody just saw, it was inspired by the classic Technicolor film, The Wizard of Oz. And it certainly had a similar feel in how it created a kind of fantasy-like dream world with a large cast, with musical performances and extravagant colors and colorful costumes. So the film was released when Germany was severely weakened by the war. And so the film provided an opportunity to boost the country's morale by providing them with an escape from the harsh realities of war in daily life.
And Marie Nejar reflected back on this experience many years later. We have a video clip so we can hear from her in her own words. This is from an interview that she gave to a journalist named Jermaine Raffington in 2015. At this point, Marie Nejar, may she live long and be well. She's with us today. At this point, she's 84 years old. Let's hear from her.
Goebbels unterschrieben, dass ich also von der Schule befreit werden müsste für 14 Tage und bin in Berlin dann alleine angekommen. Wo ich mich sehr gut erinnere, das ist der Film Münchhausen, da war ich dann auch 12 Jahre alt und da wurden wir so als Pagen sozusagen engagiert. Wir hatten sehr schicke Kostüme, hatten einen riesengroßen Wedel, so einen Fächerwedel und mussten damit den Damen frische Luft zufächern. Ja, wir waren eigentlich immer so die Trottel. Ich habe das doch noch nicht mal als Propaganda gesehen, diese Filme. Weil ich habe einfach gedacht, ach gut, dass man uns auch in die Filme reinbringt. Um was es wirklich ging, das ist mir eigentlich gar nicht klar geworden. Das ist mir dann erst später klar geworden, als ich dann, da war ich dann 14.
So once she came to this realization, did she continue to act in similar Nazi productions?
Yes, I mean, but I think it's important that we understand that Nejar was just a child when she came to this realization of being involved in propaganda films. And I think that's important to understand for her career and legacy. And even though Marie Nejar's grandmother didn't want her to be acting in these films, they needed the money. So a lack of other opportunities available to Black Germans at the time forced Nejar to stay in the entertainment industry, like it did for other Black Germans, I would say, as well.
Right. And no matter how degrading or distasteful they might have found the experience, what other choices did they have? Let's in fact turn to another individual who also played this kind of prop role, as you said, in Nazi films, a Black German actor named Bayume Mohamed Husen.
Sure. So his full name is Maju bin Adam Mohamed Husen. He was born in 1904 in what was then German East Africa. He moved to Germany as an adult in the 1920s, and he shortened his name then to what we now know as Bayume Mohamed Husen. He lived in Berlin before the Nazi regime came into power, and under the Nazis, Hussein performed odd jobs to make ends meet, so including a number of different acting roles. He acted in 23 films between 1934 and 1940 as an extra, sometimes having a few speaking roles. So here he is, for example, in this 1938 German comedy film called 5 Million Look for an Heir.
But his life took a very violent and bad turn. What eventually led to his change in circumstances and his downfall?
Yes, so his romantic relations with white German women, interracial relations were considered such a threat to Nazi laws and to, for violating German purity and the like. So the Nazis justified stripping Husen of his protected status by accusing him of fathering a child with a white German woman and in violation of German racial laws. So he was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in September 1941, and unfortunately he died there in 1944. So more than 60 years later, there's a small brass plate now, a Stolperstein or stumbling stone, that was placed in the pavement outside the home of his last known address in Berlin. There are more than 70,000 stumbling stones around the world. Each one is an individual memorial for a Nazi victim. The stone that honors Husen commemorates Black victims of Nazism, a group that's all too often forgotten.
And the stone, as it is intended, helps to keep his name and his memory alive. The motto for the Stumbling Stone project is "One victim, one stone," which references a teaching from the Talmud, the book of Jewish law, that a person is only forgotten when his name is forgotten. And a viewer named Georgia writes in with a similar sentiment saying, "Thank you for sharing this story. We need to hear all of them as a way of remembering the horrors committed against anyone who Hitler saw as a hindrance to his race cleansing agenda." Thank you for that, Georgia. Doreen, another viewer, writes to ask, was there any reaction from the US government to the arrest of Freddie Johnson and other American artists? Kyra, Thurman, can you speak to that, or do you know?
Perhaps a little bit. It is well known. And what's so interesting, again, is that you have African-American artists like Belita Snow writing letters that appear in African-American newspapers, writing letters from her camp where she's interned, documenting her experience and saying that she's okay, she's alive, those kinds of things. But perhaps, Kyra, Schuster, I don't know if you have thoughts on having looked at Freddie Johnson's file in particular to know if there was an official US government response to him.
Officially, I do not know. I know that in some cases, the Americans in these internment camps were kept in slightly better conditions because they were going to be used by the Germans for prisoner exchanges, so as leverage. So presumes to me that the American government was certainly very much aware of what was going on with their citizens who were held prisoners in Europe. But diplomatically, I'm really not sure what was happening behind the scenes, unfortunately.
I mean, perhaps another way of thinking about it is even if the US government had known, if it's 1941 and in the middle of the war, what could they necessarily have done about it? That sort of becomes the more, maybe a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I've seen documented cases within materials in our collection where American citizens in Europe were specifically told by the US government they needed to leave and return back to the United States. Obviously, many of them did not or could not, and had various fates as a result.
And I think that's an important point, that there is no uniform narrative here, that, particular circumstances, the context, the time and place in which a person found themselves could have a radically different impact on their fate. I'm reminded by Doreen's question that even the sister of Fiorella LaGuardia, the mayor of New York City, was imprisoned in a German camp. And, this is someone with deep political connections, and he was not able to secure the release of his sister. Kyra, Schuster, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and pick up again with Josef Nassy, the painter. How did the items in his that he created, how did they end up in our collection at the museum, and how do they help us better understand this little-known chapter of the history?
So after liberation, Josef Nassy stayed in the town of Laufen for almost a year after the internment camp was liberated by the Americans. He was very determined to keep his entire collection of artwork and keep it together and intact. And he managed to do that. He also managed to get it all out of Germany. He returned to Belgium and held an exhibition of his works in 1946. I think people might be surprised to hear how early that was. And here's a poster from the Brussels exhibit of that year. He continued to create art. He took place in several exhibitions of Holocaust later in his life. Amazingly, it was through the Nassi collection that my colleagues and I at the museum connected with Freddie Johnson's family. I've had the opportunity to meet with several of both the Nassi members of the Nassi family and members of the Johnson family, and learn more about their experiences and see additional photos from that time and learn more about what they experienced personally.
We are so grateful to those family members for sharing their precious, precious artifacts with us so that they can teach a broader segment of the public. Kyra, Schuster, we have a question from a viewer named Gloria asking what became of Freddie Johnson and if he was ever reunited with his family.
Freddie was released during a prisoner exchange. As I mentioned before, those did happen in February 1944. He returned to the United States in March, and he and other former Nazi prisoners did speak out about their experiences with the Black American press. Johnson continued to perform and play music. His wife and daughters were also released at a different time in a different prisoner exchange and joined him back home a few months later in June 1944. For me, it's always amazing when we can connect the dots between our collections, like Nassi and Johnson's story and how they overlap, and other families who had loved ones in that camp who've shared their stories and added that information. And Edna, as you know, my favorite analogy is I like to think of the museum's collection of Holocaust evidence as a jigsaw puzzle with no edges. We are continually adding pieces to it, and every day we learn more and more about what happens.
And also how we look at materials. If you look at a photograph in isolation, it's different than when we look at it juxtaposed against someone else's story together. It sets a very different light. Mm-hmm. Member of our audience named Amy writes in to say, for the Nazis, it was about race and hatred, and I'm so glad that the Johnson family survived. Professor Thurman, can you please tell us, as long as we are tracing the fates of the people we've been introduced to today, tell us what became of Marie Nejar after the war and what you think the bigger significance is of a story like hers?
Sure. So after the war, she became a German pop singer, actually. But unfortunately, she still experienced racism. So for example, her stage manager made her adopt the stage name Leila Negra that you see here and advertise her performances under that moniker without her consent. Soon after she left the entertainment industry, though, soon after that, she left the entertainment industry and became a nurse. Nejar, I should say, as I think Dr. Friedberg already said, is Nejar is still alive and with us today and supportive of Black activism and communities. She has always considered herself to be a German through and through.
And it's remarkable that she feels that way, despite the ways that we see she was really treated as a novelty act, not only during the Nazi period, but later. But she has a very nuanced and I think kind of optimistic way of describing her reaction to racism. Let's hear a little more from her in her own words.
Schmerzen und Verluste, die Marie durch den Nationalsozialismus erfahren hat, und die daraus folgende ambivalente Beziehung zu ihrem Heimatland, ist es ihr trotzdem wichtig, etwas anzumerken.
Ich muss ganz ehrlich sagen, ich habe auch vielen Deutschen zu verdanken, dass ich hier heute mit 84 Jahren sitze. Das darf man auch nicht vergessen. Also es gibt immer Menschen, die 100%ig toll sind.
Doch den Blick für große Probleme hat sie trotzdem nicht verloren.
Ich höre es noch manchmal, dass jemand sagt, guck mal, der Neger da, das passiert schon noch. Der Rassismus hat ja insofern nicht aufgehört, weil ja schon wieder eine ganze junge Generation sich damit befasst. Ich habe auch erlebt, dass so einige Rassisten um mich so rumgegangen und mal gesagt, Sieg heil, Sieg heil. Und da habe ich gesagt, wisst ihr was, das kann ich besser. Das habe ich auch schon gelernt. Ich musste mich mit so vielen Dingen auseinandersetzen, dass ich, glaube ich, irgendwann gedacht habe, ihr könnt mich alle mal.
That clip is, yeah, so interesting and so fascinating. So I do hope that people understand that stories like Marie Nejar's stories are stories of Black victimization and discrimination, absolutely, but also, as hopefully you saw from that clip, stories of resilience and people finding ways to be creative and to be themselves in the midst of horrible persecution.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for helping to shed light on the Black artists that we met today. It was really a pleasure to speak with and learn from two different Kyras in two different locations.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Edna.
And today we remember and pay tribute to Black people, artists in particular, who found themselves under the thumb of the Nazi racist regime. Their experiences, their contributions to the arts, and also helping us to better understand and fill in gaps in the complex history of this era. At the end of today's show, we will be sharing additional resources that the museum has in order to help you, our viewers, to understand the racist ideology of Nazi Germany and the devastating impact that these ideas had on so many millions of lives. We hope you will join us for our next show as well on a different day of the week, Tuesday, February 22nd at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time in the US, when we will be learning about a group of German university students who spoke out bravely against the Nazi regime. They distributed thousands of leaflets around Germany, urging ordinary people to rise up, and these student activists eventually paid the ultimate price. 79 years ago this month, members of the White Rose resistance group were executed, and we will pay tribute to them on that grim anniversary. In the meantime, wherever you are watching, be healthy and well, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.